and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a left adequate to 21st century conditions. So I just want to announce a few kind of activities of what the Knoxville group does. So there's a weekly reading group. What is the left? What is Marxism? Which happens on Sundays, Sundays at 2:30 in the Humanities and Social Sciences building. Coffee breaks that take place also on Sundays immediately after the reading group in the Starbucks by Hodges. There's an open submission journal, the Platypus Review, that's available right over here. And it's completely free. Take any, take all. But we also have public forums such as this one, teach-ins, panel discussions. And if you are interested in what we have to say, you want to get involved or want to learn more, there's a sign-in sheet so you can be on our email list, etc. So tonight's panel is specific on the politics of work, and I just want to give you a little bit of a brief description of what it's all about, so we can know what we're getting into. So it's generally assumed that Marxists and other leftists have the political responsibility to support reforms for the improvement of the welfare of workers. Yet, leading figures of the Marxist tradition, such as Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, also understood that such reforms would broaden the crisis of capitalism and potentially intensify the contradictions that could adversely impact the immediate conditions of workers. For instance, full employment, while being a natural demand from the standpoint of all workers' interests, also threatens the conditions of capitalist production, which rely on a surplus of available labor, thereby potentially jeopardizing the system of employment altogether. In light of such apparent paradoxes, this panel seeks to investigate the politics of work from leftist perspectives. It will attempt to provoke reflection on and discussion of the ambiguities and dilemmas of the politics of work by including speakers from divergent perspectives, some of whom seek after the immediate abolition of labor and others who seek to increase the availability of employment opportunities. It is hoped that this conversation will deepen the understanding of the contemporary problems faced by the left in its struggles to construct a politics adequate to the self-emancipation of the working class. So just a few guidelines of how tonight's going to work. We ask that the panelists consider this as a set of related questions in formulating their opening remarks. So panelists will have between 9 and 11 minutes to deliver their opening remarks. I will discreetly signal when panelists are at 9 minutes, and then we'll verbally inform the panelists when they have a minute to go. Then at 11 minutes, I'll stand up, at which time the panelists should try to wrap up as soon as possible. After the opening remarks, there'll be an opportunity for very brief responses by the panelists, no more than 3.5 minutes. This will be strictly enforced as to avoid cutting into Q&A time. After responses, we'll have discussion and open up the floor for hopefully around an hour or so of Q&A. And I ask that audience members try to keep their questions to about a minute in length. If there are a lot of questions, we'll try to take them in groups of 2s or 3s. And of course, we hope that everyone can keep track of all the questions that are asked. And we intend to be done at 9 p.m. sharp. So, at around 8:45, I'll try to cut off all questions and maybe make some concluding remarks. So let's introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Bob Hutton, Senior Lecturer of History and American Studies at the University of Tennessee, with specializations in the American South and Appalachia. He's done research on the private security industry in the progressive era Appalachia, with special emphasis on the relationship between Jim Crow and Southern capitalism. In 2013, he published
Redlit.
Sorry, say that again.
Bloody Redlit.
Politics and Violence in the Appalachian South, which won the Appalachian Studies Association's 2013 Weatherford Award for Nonfiction. Bob is also an active member of the United Campus Workers Union. And Jack, would you like to introduce yourself or delegate someone to?
I was going to ask our comrade Shannon Williams to introduce me.
So, this is Jack Aaron. My name is Shannon Williams. I met Jack many years ago at we did a Woody Guthrie tribute at the Laurel Theater, and I was studying sociology at the University of Tennessee here on campus, and was into radical politics, and in the middle of a dissertation on some of the stuff that we're talking about now. And Jack and I linked up and played music. Jack's also very informed about the politics in Latin America, and at this time, all of the popular sectors had taken control in the South, in Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia. And Jack had just come from Bolivia, so he was very familiar with the politics that were taking shape there, and it was informing his music and kind of his political moral compass. And so, I think he's unique insofar as that he is finding a lot of parallels and consistencies with the experience of workers in Bolivia, in the Andes, right, and then drawing on those connections and the relationships that the mining communities have in the Andes with the mining communities in Appalachia, right? So, writing some very interesting things and doing a lot of good art in that direction. So,
Thank you. Then we have Steve Berger is a member of the Tennessee branch of the Industrial Workers of the World. He's an electrician by trade, nearly 20 years of experience. Prior to that, he was a laminator in the boat building industry. Steve is a proud member of the working class, and the most important thing to him is to promote solidarity among that class. And then finally, Matt Cavagrati. I've never actually heard, never actually said it like out loud, but just call you Matt for short. Is a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society as well as the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He became involved in Platypus several years ago and was studying at the University of Tennessee, during which he served as chapter president for a time. Matt presently works for UPS, where he is a union steward for a shift. He's also active in Teamsters for a Democratic Union, a rank-and-file effort that seeks to build Teamsters' power and put the union to work for its members. So, without further delay, I'll go ahead and let the panelists make their case. So, I guess, are we...
Let's just go on down the line.
Yeah, let's go down the line of the order that I introduced them in.
Okay, well, I'm not appreciative Matt asking me to take part in this tonight. Last week I was looking at some of the talking points he handed me, trying to get inspired and also trying to think of a few things that overlapped between some of Platypus's main issues when it comes to self-emancipation, vis-a-vis some of the research I've done about people who are trying to do the exact opposite. That is, like you mentioned, the private security industry of the progressive era, an industry that is, of course, still in existence. The Pinkertons still exist as an organization. The Baldwin-Phelps Detective Agency does not, but organizations very much like it operate on a global scale. And I'm afraid I probably came up with a lot of ideas that tended more toward my own research than some of the things Matt suggested I talk about.
It happens.
But yeah, it does. And then I looked at my notes again this evening before coming over here. And by the way, I have a terrible head cold right now, so don't expect me to be completely understandable. But I looked at the notes and I thought, what the hell did I write? So I'm trying to make sense of what I wrote sometime last week, what I was thinking about. And most of what was on my mind was really the barriers to the working class, particularly the barriers that are in some ways paradigmatic to the 21st century specifically. And that is elements that we don't necessarily, stuff we wouldn't necessarily think of as being overarching in the 1920s, you know, the so-called American system and stuff like that. And also an era without anything looking like a moderate New Deal as we would have had in the 1930s or a great society in the 1960s. So I think what I was doing last week was sort of a little bit of armchair futurism, and I erased about half of it. But what I had left here was a few ideas about a few things that people like Luxemburg and perhaps almost anyone except Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci of the 1920s, 1930s, who I think was very prescient among Marxists in recognizing the growth of corporations. Now, I want to stress that when I say corporations, I don't mean just capital itself, but the the actual historical phenomenon of the corporation that is basically larger than the sum of its parts, if you will. An organization that relies on the participation of shareholders, but I think most importantly, exists over the course of many human lifetimes. I always point out to my students how long it's been since Walt Disney actually walked this earth. And yet we have a corporation called Disney that basically controls a good probably 40% of what we watch in media, perhaps more than that. I think about corporations quite a bit because it would seem as if they're almost destined in the 21st century to supplant the nation state in the sort of the same way that the nation state once supplanted the old absolutist regimes, and the way that the absolutist regimes sort of supplanted the old balance between kings and nobility and so forth. You see a lot of cases where people recognize their relationship to corporations as being a more active relationship than the relationship they have with their government or with their particular state. And when I was going along with that line of thought, I couldn't stop thinking about woke capitalism. Matt had encouraged me in the list to talk a little bit about the relationship between capitalism and the politics of race and gender. And it occurred to me that, corporations like Walmart and Chick-fil-A have gained a lot of dividends by taking specific political positions, not necessarily the same positions, and trying to attract a particular type of consumer, and ultimately to become political actors themselves. And in some cases, like when Walmart bravely decided they weren't going to sell Confederate flags anymore. Of course, this takes people's attention away from how much they pay their employees, but still, this is sort of scoring one for woke capitalism in a sense. What does this leave us with in our old question about the left's old debate, the old internal debate within the left about politics versus just organizing strictly on the shop floor? And this is an argument that I'd say some of y'all are very familiar with, that took place very much around 1920, around the time that the Socialist Party of America was split off into right and left factions. If we get to a time period in which politics as we generally understand it has become irrelevant, and one's workaday existence in a Chattanooga Amazon warehouse becomes the norm, I think we end up with almost forced into thinking purely in terms of the former case, thinking just in terms of organizing on the shop floor, and almost being forced to abandon politics altogether. I'm not sure everyone necessarily is ready for that in the next 5 to 10 years, but I do think that's the sort of paradigmatic shift we're looking at in the next 50 or 60 years. Finally, aside from just the sheer, what I call the post-national existence of the corporation, we also do recognize, and I think probably other people on the panel are going to mention this, a growing crisis within capitalism that's popping up in multiple parts of the world. The ones that are on my mind right at the moment are in Chile and perhaps Hong Kong and a handful of other places, and of course Greece a few years ago, that seem to be demonstrating that capitalism is running out of the two things that it always sort of required, that is a wealth of natural resources and a wealth of readily available cheap labor. And yet, revolution, the way we think of it from a Marxian perspective, seems that much further away. So what seems more likely to happen from a post-national workers' globe I think would probably be more something appearing more like insurrection rather than revolution. That is, workers sort of trying to find some sort of state for themselves under the radar of the corporation state, rather than, you know, the traditional sense of a relatively sudden revolution taking place after the crisis of capitalism. One more thing. I am very concerned about the role of the new nationalism that we see taking place in the United States, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in Poland, and so many other countries. That I think one economist has called it global Trumpism. I guess you could. That's as good a name for it as any other. And what's very curious about it, and I'll finish with this because this is a scary enough thought to finish with. It seems like the new nationalism seems to be just as much of a reaction to, perhaps even against, the neoliberal regime. That is more or less a reaction against capitalism in some ways, just as much as socialism ever was. And so, even though, you know, I started off saying that there's many things that we cannot learn from the 1920s and 1930s, I think ultimately we may be looking at a situation very much like 1936 to 1939 in Spain. That is the irrelevancy of liberal democracy, and ultimately just sort of a confrontation between the true left and the nationalist right. And I'll stop there. Thank you. I hope that was coherent.
Yeah, for certain. I'm going to hold this guitar while I'm talking and speak for a few minutes, and then maybe sing for a few minutes. Once again, my name is Jack Harrinan. Knoxville's been my home base for my adult life. I grew up south of here, just about an hour, kind of between here and Chattanooga, in a warped little place called Cleveland, Tennessee. It was the Church of God of Prophecy World Headquarters. It's a hard place to be in high school in the 1980s. I graduated high school down there in 1985 and got out as soon as I could. Broke my leash on my lead line and moved up here to Knoxville. Worked in the old city in an old coffee shop that used to be down there called Cup of Joe's. Spent some time around campus here, and this was before life threw me a beautiful curveball, and in the late 90s, I went down to Mexico to meet up with an old buddy and just to recover from a rough patch of family tragedy, and I was down for a couple months in the central highlands of Mexico, up north of Mexico City, in one of the main old hubs of the silver mines, a place called Guanajuato. And I crossed paths with a woman there in the streets, and she was from South America, from Bolivia. Was a traveling artist, and we fell in love and started walking a path together. She came up to the States here with me. And as soon as I had a chance, I jumped at the opportunity to go to South America with her. and it was no easy or normal route. We have 2 children together, and I think so highly and fondly of her. Her name is Valentina Campos, and she's a painter and a radical feminist, kind of on the ground revolutionary, with a circle of artists and university-based folks down there in a department of Bolivia that's in the middle of the country. Is called Cochabamba. The capital city that most people at least have heard of is La Paz, Bolivia, which is at about 12,500 feet in the Andes, a big metropolitan city, but strong, informed by indigenous value systems. So it's a really fascinating place to have your feet on the ground in La Paz, Bolivia. So when I departed the U.S. with her to go down to South America, there was a couple pieces that defined things for me. One is that most people know about the dirty wars in Latin America, kind of the U.S. sponsored initiatives with dictatorships in power to crush kind of social progressive forces. And it's gone on for so many decades. And most of us, it kind of falls off our radar that the dirty wars lasted up into the 1980s. So my boy's mother, her parents were artists and revolutionaries aligned with the trajectory of Che Guevara. And so she was essentially a survivor of the dirty wars. So that demanded that I reckon with that I crack myself open and go down there walking with a survivor of the dirty wars. And on top of that, when I first went with her down to Bolivia, it was before the citizenry had reclaimed their agency, before they had called back in their popular memory and their capacity to rebel. There was a standing president at that time who was recycled. He was an early dictator, trained at the School of Americas in Georgia, and he was a general. His name was General Hugo Banzer. He was in power when I went down there, and he was in the process of being toppled. Upon arriving there, literally, it was the moment when the citizenry were taking back the streets and university campuses and realizing that it was time to overthrow this president. So literally, the day that I arrived in the airport, which is up above La Paz, at 14,000 feet, in a far out outlying city unto itself, up above La Paz. It's called El Alto. It's it was basically the working class slums of the city, and was home to farmers, displaced farmers and ex-miners. Primarily, there's two main the two largest indigenous groups in the Andes are the Aymara and the Quechua. And the Aymara of the highlands are very militant, and El Alto is a stronghold of the Aymara people of the Andes. So the day I arrived, La Paz, the capital, which is 2,000 feet down below El Alto in a big bowl was in a state of martial law, literally. The day I flew into El Alto and we took a city bus down into La Paz, it was in a state of siege with the military out on the streets. And so it was a baptism of sorts, and that recuperated popular power just kept building and building over the subsequent years. And I won't try to encapsulate the period of time a few years later that became known as the Water War. Maybe there will be another moment when I can swing around and kind of try to put that in a nutshell for you all. I don't know how we're doing on.
I'm not keeping time. That'd be
About 2.5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So just to mix it up, I'm going to play a song that's called Rebel Working Man. I wrote it just across the river here over in South Knoxville in a little rough and tumble pocket called Vestal. I assume at least a couple of y'all heard of Vestal. On the trains and in the quarries and on the factory floor, farming your fields and fishing your shore, we were millions strong, we were tried, we were true. Now what's a rebel boy to do? Well, our kinfolk were hungry and they held Union cards, and their dreams were beat down by Pinkerton guards. My dreams don't stay down, they rise with the dew. Now what's a rebel boy to do? This rebel working man is doing what he can, son, doing what he can. Well, our jobs headed south, and from there they went east, and those from the south come north on a train called the Beast. Well, who's driving that train? Let me drop a few clues. It's what a rebel boy can do. Well, I could flip burgers, or care for the old, or go to work in the prisons, or hell, try mining for gold, or start cooking meth with a toxic stew. It's what a rebel boy can do. This rebel working man is doing what he can, son, doing what he can. Well, your free speech and lunch breaks and 8-hour days, let's not forget that they're all union made. Yes, the union is broken, and yes, it's in pain, but aren't we all from capital's gains? So come you workers and farmers and students and bums, and all you marginalized fires and oil drums. Yes, you preachers and teachers, we need you too. It's what a rebel boy can do. This rebel working man is doing what he can, son, doing what he can. This rebel working man is doing what he can, son, doing what he can.
All right.
Thanks, Jack, for leaving me that.
As he spoke in industrial workers of the world. I'm also a trade unionist. I'm an IBEW member. I don't call that my union because I have very little voice in that union as opposed to the Tennessee IWW. Those members have a voice. So there's been antagonism between trade unions and revolutionary unions such as the IWW. And it has a lot to do with the question a lot of times of strategies and the very question of if you make conditions better at the time, you ultimately make capital able to be preserved. And this dichotomy is what we have to deal with. If you look at the early days of the trade unions, the AFL-CIO, before it was the AFL, it was originally the AFL with Samuel Gompers. If you read the original preamble, it sounded pretty much like a quote from the Communist Manifesto. The present preamble of the AFL-CIO sounds nothing like that. The IWW stands by a principle that the employing class and the working class have nothing in common, and these two cannot be reconciled as long as there's these drastic extremes within capital, of those that have and those that don't have. Trade union, especially modern trade unions, operates under the philosophy that capital and labor are partners in the same. This is one of the reasons there's the antagonisms between the IWW and trade unions. Both of them present questions of how to deal with the situation with a dominant power. One allows the dominant power to remain in place. The other one would prefer its removal. I believe that we are approaching a crisis within capitalism that it's unsustainable. Capitalism, in my opinion, is based on constant westward expansion, and there's no more west to expand to. It's been globalized. And so once you reach peak market saturation, the only thing left to do is collapse. And I think that's where we're in. Those that are in power know that, and they're trying to set a course. And the reason they're trying to set a course, and they've been very effective at it up until this point, is the same reason that the IWW operates off of the principle of educate, agitate, and organize. Capital has been an education phase for years, reprogramming people from a revolutionary mindset to accepting their lot as employees. Now, one of the questions that is posed within this is the difference between work and employment, and consequently unemployment. Now, of a Jewish philosophy that follows the philosophies of Einstein and Spinoza, I believe that natural law is a place to start. And I think work is a natural phenomenon. Animals do it. It's inescapable. In order to survive, you will have to work in one way, shape, or form. Human beings have the ability to leverage that because of automation, technology, like that. But at the core of it, there's still work that has to be done. So when you look at it from the base of it, like I started out by saying the Tennessee IWW is a chartered branch of the IWW. I look at things from an organic level. You have to build from an organic level. Most of what I see in the history of what's called the left, and that's the question in itself, what is the left? Because many people will define the left differently. Is it authoritarian? Is it democratic? All these are questions that have to be resolved in discussion, but there is no specific answer to that because each person will have a view in their own mind. But I know everybody in my branch will call themselves leftists. So, however that's defined, in their mind, they're clear, and we're clear that we're leftists. So, going forward, building organically, it's always been dealt with as seizing the means of production, taking over what's already there, as opposed to building another alternative. Building an alternative means you start from scratch instead of taking what's already been built on a faulty premise to start with. So, to me, the best answer for that is workers' cooperatives, where you build communally, you build relationships, and organically. And once you have that, then automatically you have the perseverance of the individuals because they're committed relationship-wise. They're committed at a local level. And when it comes to the distribution of resources, I believe you have to start locally and work with what you have. You don't build a rock house in the middle of the woods, you build a wood house. And so I think it's kind of, it's going a little bit far to say that we can come up with this beautiful plan of how it's going to work out when it's going to be based on the individual resources of each community and how they can resolve that. Instead of trying to come up with a plan that you may not have the colors to paint. So, from my perspective, that's the best approach, is to build alternatives based on sustainable outcomes, possibly reducing a living standard that's based on what those local resources can sustain and building from there. I think the concept of society is too much of a monopolized concept. You can't say we have one society because you have multiple societies within that society. You have multiple power structures. And to try to say there's one thing that's going to fit all, I think that does not acknowledge the differences that human beings have in the individuality and how each group interacts with other groups. I think ultimately, and this is the Jewishness in me, it has to be motivated by compassion, by love. And with that compassion and that love and that empathy, then you realize that within the system, everybody is tormented in one way or another. And to try to understand that torment, that empathy and that compassion is what builds the relationships that allows a movement to be established. And it's based on that power of collective struggle that you can build. Not denying that there's individual struggles within that, and that there's disproportionate struggles. And with that disproportionate, there has to be that awareness and that ability to deal with the pain that the system has caused. And going forward, to look at those lessons and build from that, and build at a communal level based on relationships that are locally sustainable.
You have 3 minutes left. You want to spend it? Or?
Well,
If not, you don't have to, of course.
okay, I'll defer.
Last but not least.
Hi. I wrote my remarks because I don't think I'm on my feet well and I'm terrified of public speaking, so bear with me. Marxism is only one of the potential ideologies on the left, but the reason I think it retains its salience is because of its critique of history. Marx understood that capitalism is completely unprecedented in history, not because of exploitation and oppression, which is as old as civilization and predates it in nature. What's new and different about capital is social domination. Previous forms of civilization knew some form of overt domination by some group over others, but never a dynamic to which all groups and society as a whole are subject. The reason I think this matters is because if it's just exploitation and oppression, then you can say that nothing has ever changed, not only in human history, but in natural history. So it's not just about rich people and poor people, oppressors and oppressed, exploiters and exploited. That does not distinguish our time from any other time, and yet our time is profoundly different from any other in history. For Marx, the only thing that distinguished capitalism in history is the possibility for socialism. Capitalism has a possibility for a potentiality, but it also has a necessity of socialism that makes it new and different than any other. And that's only true with the Industrial Revolution. We're in the midst of the possibility and necessity for change greater than any other that has ever taken place, ever. The revolutionary overcoming of capitalism would render it part of prehistory. Prehistorical in the sense that it's the same as nature. the transition to socialism would be greater than that which gave birth to modern civilization, greater than that which gave birth to civilization itself, both of which were massive and changed everything. Or so Marxism thought. One of the reasons that Platypus says that the left is dead is because nobody believes that anymore. Or they only believe it in the most obscure way, like with climate catastrophe, which just becomes about technology, not about politics and society, but rather some technical fix, and the greedy capitalists and stupid consumers that get in the way. Marxism's not about this or that group. Some people are on the top and some are on the bottom. That's been true all throughout history, and that can be reversed. You can overthrow your masters. Marx is talking about something much deeper than that. He's talking about the relationship between class and history. The question is, how is the task of history being expressed through the class struggle in capitalism? When we talk about equality on the left today, this is too often assumed to mean equality of material wealth or opportunity, such that economic equality is the goal in itself. For Marx, economic inequality was not the main problem. It was a consequence and a breeding ground of domination. To be dominated is to be subject to the whims or caprice of others, to have no control over whether or not they interfere with you, your life, your actions, your body. Whether or not they actually hurt you is less important than the fact that they have the power to hurt you, and you can't control whether or not or how they use that power. It's in this space of uncertainty and fear that power does its work. Historically, this is the space out of which organized labor arose. But for Marx, that this took the form of one class struggling against another was just a symptom. The point is that in capitalism, even the capitalists aren't free. If you ask your friend for a job at his firm, he might knit his brow and say that it's objectively impossible. Business is bad, and he's even been obliged to let a number of people go. His freedom doesn't extend that far. He's subject to laws and conditions which weren't created either by him or anyone else with any deliberation, in which no one individual has the ability to change. Capitalism confronts us as a sort of anonymous social reality, even an external force that dominates our freedom. The irony is that we create it through our own activity, and therefore it can be changed. So workers have become divided against themselves because the fundamental category of labor has become divided against itself. Class is just an expression of that. It's the effect, not the cause, of the contradiction of capitalism. Capitalism is the self-contradiction of labor, of the socialized production of value, but the individual appropriation of wealth that's expressed through the contradiction between wage labor and capital. It's not social antagonism. That's not what contradiction means. It's a self-contradiction of the social relations of production itself, a self-contradiction of the cosmos in which we live, the cosmos of labor. And this comes from below. It's spontaneously generated by the people themselves. It's a democratic phenomenon. That's why the people themselves have to change it. The workers have to change it. They're creating it. Marxists were the first and have remained the most consistent in recognizing the nature and character of this contradiction in modern society. This is why workers look to Marxists in the first place. Some recognize that in banding together to improve their material conditions and position in society, that they were only more intimately tying themselves to the problem, indeed deepening it. Marxist intellectuals came to support the labor movement and advocate the rights of labor, but they also understood that the ultimate end of that struggle was for the working class to abolish itself as a class. Marxism is just the self-consciousness of that the workers' struggle within capitalism is what produces the crisis of capitalism that will lead to socialism. But this consciousness can only be grasped from outside the immediate economic struggle, from outside the sphere of relations between workers and employers. It's the sphere of relationships of all classes and strata between themselves and to the state and government. And this is the sphere of intellectuals. It's the work of theory. The purpose of the unity of workers and intellectuals in the masked party for socialism is to elevate the consciousness of the class struggle to its highest possible expression, its most politically advanced expression of the more general contradiction of capitalism. Socialists only ever sought to utilize labor unions for highly specific purposes. Socialist leadership of organized labor was meant to preserve the independence of the working class from the capitalist state politics of the ruling class and its parties. Socialist parties of the era of the Second International accomplished no reforms whatsoever in terms of capitalist state policies or laws. Sure, they had a legislative agenda, but they never changed any state or federal laws or even state, let alone federal administrative policies. They fought for these changes in order to build power. So what did they accomplish? Only the independent civil social organization of the workers. The reforms they accomplished were in terms of civil society, that is, better contracts between workers and employers, and carving out a social space for the working class. They were real, but they were independent of, and indeed often despite, the governmental policies or laws. There are, as such, no possible socialist demands of the capitalist state other than to leave us alone. So what's the alternative? The patient building of socialist parties until they're powerful enough to take over the state. For socialists, labor struggles were all about training workers politically to be able to lead the people democratically to take over the state. Historical socialism wasn't just economic demands and it wasn't just protest. It was political and social in a different sense. It was about organizing people to take political power and training them to be able to wield that power at a local level. Today, there's no mass socialist party in America, and there hasn't been a serious attempt to form one in half a century. The last great attempt was in the 1970s, when a number of socialist groups encouraged their members to abandon intellectual lives and take jobs in strategic industries in order to help organize worker opposition to both the corporation and bureaucratic union leadership. One of these was the International Socialists, which is where my organization, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, came from. The IS developed a strategy of building grassroots militancy within the unions, caucuses for minority and women workers, and urging independent political action of the workers' organizations. In doing so, they proposed direction to the growing rank-and-file movement without making sectarian demands on that movement. This approach distinguished the IS from much of their contemporaries, which wrote off the union as hopelessly privileged and conservative. They also sought to establish commonality with workers by sharing their experiences and values, and being completely honest about their beliefs. This distinguished them from the preceding generation, which attempted to become leaders by hiding or downplaying their communist affiliations. Now the IS's strategy didn't work out, at least not quite in the way that they planned. They weren't able to use the rank-and-file strategy to build a new socialist party, but they did have an outsized impact on the labor movement. If consciousness grows from struggle and self-activity, then unions, despite their limitations, can be, as Engels put it, schools of war in which the workers prepare themselves for larger fights to come and become fit for administrative and political work. But this is only true if unions are willing and able to struggle effectively, to mobilize the workers to engage in that struggle, and for the members to have access to the union's administration and politics. The rank-and-file strategy helps make this possible. What it does not do, however, is train workers to politically to be able to lead the people to take over the state so that they can expropriate capitalist industry, democratically plan the economy, and defend against the counter-revolution. That's the patient work of the Socialist Party. The question is, why don't we have one today? I don't have time to get into this, so I'm hoping that we can address it through the questions and answers.
All right, so the next part of it is responses amongst the panelists. So it's supposed to be about 3.5 minutes. What order do you want to go in, or do you want to
Just say it, yeah, it's fine.
We can go back in the same order that we started with. Or go on your
Yeah, I wrote a lot of things down while Matt was talking, but let me defer to somebody else. I might pick up later on.
Okay, sure.
Is
So
that okay?
yeah, that's perfect. Or just like respond. Or does anyone have any comments, responses to anyone else, or is it
General
just
remarks. Yeah.
I'd like to hear more about why you don't feel like you have a much of a role in the IBEW. What's the structural issue in the IBEW?
It is a top-down union,
Yeah.
and policies are set, and even your locals, your local unions that are chartered have limited power based on what the international allows them to have. And if they conflict with the international, their charters can be taken and they no longer exist as a union body.
So it's sort of the same problem you have with the AFL-CIO, or back there that is your community, right?
But essentially set up under the same power structure.
So, I say, we can skip straight to questions if no one has any,
Well, there's,
comments.
and, as both a trade unions and a revolutionary unions, and I can see things from both perspectives, and both of them have tangible arguments for their type of unionism. But ultimately, from an organic perspective, and this is why I would disagree with the concept of taking over the state, because you're still operating from a top-down philosophy. And I believe in operating organically, and that each individual group or entity having its own, you see what I'm saying? And operating from there instead of having a single socialist party. I'm also a member of Jobs with Justice, which is a coalition of organizations. It says you don't have to belong to my union. You don't have to belong to my particular, because we have similar aims, so therefore we build alliances and work from there. So it acknowledges the autonomy of each individual organization and its aims, and takes the collective mutual interests and works together in that perspective.
I mean, that's sort of like what I was saying about insurrection rather than revolution. I mean, there's only so much you can get really from the possibility of taking over the state, when in fact the state's still going to be the state.
Plato said that those that desire power are least qualified to have it. And that's generally what it works out to be, because anybody who that is their desires to grasp power, it's usually for the wrong motivations. And once they receive that power, it's to serve their own interests.
You guys think that this kind of comes down to the age-old divide between Marxism and anarchism? Is it reducible to that?
Like the First International.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The old debate between Marx and Bakunin. And I guess just to lay this out so that people know what we're talking about. After the 1848 revolutions, there was an attempt to form the first international organization of socialists, and it was called the First Working Men's International. And Marx didn't invent socialism. He was a critic of the socialist movement that already existed.
Utopians.
Yeah, and that in the course of that, both anarchists. There were a number of tendencies in the First Working Men's International, and then the big debate was about, and this is after the wake. This was in the wake of the experience of the 1848 revolutions, in which the workers, the landless proletariat, so to speak, people who had nothing to sell other than their wage labor, also made a revolution alongside the so-called bourgeoisie, or the owners of capital, against the remnants of what's called the ancient regime, the old aristocratic regime of privilege, and that ruled alongside the clergy and so on and so forth. And it was a revolution about democracy, and they made it together. And that they found that in the course of that, there were a number of different demands made on a number of different levels between cooperating groups, but that ultimately what they found that in the course of attempting to create a so-called social democracy, a democracy adequate to the social conditions of the time, is that they were only able to, the working people were only able to advance their demands so far until they infringed upon the interests of the class that they made the revolution with, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, and that ultimately what wound up happening was that the bourgeois class then collaborated, after its demands had been fulfilled, that it collaborated with the old aristocratic monarchical regime, and conspired against the workers and essentially, shut down the attempts of the workers to see their demands through to their logical conclusion, and then it raised the whole question of power. And I guess that, what I would say to, or, what happened in the First Working Men's International was centrally grouped around this issue, the issue of power, the issue of the state, so to speak. And I guess that I would respond to that by saying that, I understand the old divide that, the anarchists, the charge made against it is that, that only the social revolution is necessary, and that if you wield power, you will become tainted by it, and you will become statists, and so on and so forth. And I guess what I would say to that is that socialists, they can abandon politics, they can, but other people are not going to abandon politics. Politics is going to go on, and it's going to create Hillary Clinton's, and it's going to create Donald Trump's and everybody else. And the question is whether or not you're going, that you're willing to use that or not. And that's kind of the reason why I maintain that what a lot of the left does today, if they choose not to engage in politics directly, but they choose only social action. The problem is that in many, if not most cases, they're doing it alongside groups that are aligned with, if not actual appendages of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is not just the party, it is a whole network of institutions, of non-governmental organizations and non-profits, and so on and so forth, that organize the default constituency for capitalist politics. And when you organize in the community on issue-based stuff, issue-based campaigns, alliances based on single issue campaigns, and you organize with that apparatus, even if you're not directly engaged in politics, you're still generating the default constituency for capitalist politics. So the question is are we going to do it for ourselves? Are we going to do it for the working class party for socialism, which doesn't seek to manage capitalism, via the two existing ruling parties, but chooses to do so through the Socialist Party, that says that the only thing that we want is for you to leave us alone, so that we can create our own alternative institutions until such a time in which we can take over this institution.
You want to go ahead and open up the questions then?
Sounds good to me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a number of things that I would be interested in commenting on. One is this question of the state, and the state as kind of the practical apparatus with the monopoly on violence, and is that anything that you can just kind of neglect and write off and leave to an oppositional class to kind of take control of while we build our communities, maybe the way that Steve talked about, right? And this is a really important question. It's a question that I think was partially answered by the Paris, well, one answer to that question may be what happened with respect to the Paris Commune, right? And that was Marx's big critique. It's like, well, why didn't you really take state power when you had access? Why did you take the money? Why didn't you go ahead and create a monopoly on the means of violence to defend that free association of individuals that were... This is very interesting, too. I would like to ask Jack the same question when you were in La Paz or when the water wars broke out and the police were running away from their barracks, right? And the people were actually, driving the cop cars. Like, why was there an initiative to take the state directly in that way? I mean, eventually, right, the Popular Party won power, the MAS, right? Morales became president, but then you've got the question and the issue of the revolution betrayed and how states, no matter how intimate they are with their constituency, there's always kind of a separation there, right? And you go through these history is littered with these revolutions and then taking state power and then the state becomes, I think that's interesting. So one is the question of, right, so how, this question of the state that you bring up is really important, right? Can you just neglect that? And if you did, then what happens at the local level? And as it relates to Steve's question, right? It's like, so if you have local communities using what they have to produce, right? Are we looking then at maybe a bartering economy? Is that what we're looking at? And my question for this is that I think a bartering economy could settle a lot of the issues that we're talking about with capitalism. But I think for all we talk about the cooperatives, there's some big time problems with the cooperatives. Not because there's a lack of political will, but just the challenges that cooperatives confront in the marketplace when they're competing against corporations, right? And being subjected to the same, like Marx referred to, the law of value. So if you know anybody who's keeping a cooperative going, they're exploiting the hell out of themselves. They don't ever quit working, right? Because they can't run as efficiently as corporations. They're not as productive with their labor time because they don't have the capital assets. So everybody's working 14, 15 hours a day, and to sell a $15 squash or a commodity, right, that's way above the market value. That seems to me only sustainable if you've got a middle class liberal constituency that's willing to pay $11, $15 for a squash, right? So I don't know. There's a lot of interesting things. For me, the thing that I'm interested in is really technical solutions, right? And I think that's probably the left that's really good at deconstructing things historically, but in terms of, I think, technical solutions is what I'm really interested in. Sorry to monopolize the time, but anyways, those are things that I'm interested in. If any of y'all can speak to any of that stuff.
I mean, anyone who wants to jump in on?
Yeah, well, I'll speak briefly to that particular moment of popular insurrection in Bolivia. One thing that was favorable is that there was a living, breathing set of values already in place. Literally, indigenous, agrarian, what people called agrocentric. There was a living fabric of dignified systems, economic systems, cultural systems, made it a heck of a lot easier for people to ride a general wave of rebellion together. It was sustained by relationships running out to the countryside. Every urban revolutionary still had their grandparents growing quinoa and potatoes back in the countryside. and carried those values like in a literal shoulder bag with them. And another important factor was the binding role of coca. Most people at least know about coca, the coca leaf. In Bolivia, it's a spiritual and cultural adhesive. It holds everything together in a certain sense. It would be like if tobacco was never exploited and commoditized and tainted in this culture, if it literally remained as this sacred vehicle. So that sustained these acts of open rebellion. I mean, universities were taken over, more often than not, in any given moment, the sociology department in any university was occupied and was an encampment of students who were just holding some political ground. City bus drivers just kind of broke ranks and supported. Marchers and protesters just kind of formed new transportation routes. So that's all I'll say.
Relatedly, I think that I believe the largest cooperative enterprise in the world is London. Is that right? Or are they 15 billion or something like that in annual sales? They're not small. They're large by any measure. But when you consider that the global capitalist economy is the size of many trillions of dollars, it seems that it would take a really long time, even if we believe that the current system is built on a rough foundation. It would take a really, really long time for any kind of organic enterprise to somehow grow to the point where it could threaten the capitalist overstructure or superstructure that pretty much dominates economies around the globe now, including China and the former Soviet Union. So it's difficult for me to see. I feel like, my name's Randy, by the way, sorry I didn't introduce myself. When UCW moved for the enterprise school, I guess I feel like I understand the dissatisfaction and the belief that the current structure can't be changed from the inside, and so now you've got to build something up from the ground. But the scale of these things strike me as so disproportionate as to make that dream nearly impossible. That discourages me. What keeps you going in that?
I believe in capitalism's efficiency to the point where it will self-destruct, and the only thing that will remain is the other alternatives that have sprung up. The present system, if it's unsustainable, it'll collapse to the ground.
So when that happens, the local economies then will be the
Exactly.
ones that survive, is what you're
Exactly.
saying.
I don't believe capitalism will be overthrown by a revolution, because if you look at the times that revolutions have succeeded, from my interpretation, it's been times when people were not vested in the success of capital. You had people that literally had nothing to lose. Now you have retirements to lose, you have all kinds of benefits to lose, you have your iPhone to lose. How many people are willing to make that sacrifice in order to take that next step? And if they're not, then you're either going to have to make the present system work or wait for its collapse and build something that will survive after its collapse.
If you don't mind, I want to remark on this a little bit, because it touches on some things I've been thinking about. I mean, this really gets at like the international character of capitalism. That's what I was talking about when I said that what's new about capitalism is not exploitation and oppression, it's social domination. Like previous forms of civilization have never known a dynamic to which all groups in society as a whole is subject. Of course, it's experienced differently. There's been some talk about, the global South and how capitalism there just creates billions of disposable people. And then, of course, in the West, it's experienced a bit different. Living conditions are higher. But I think that on a general level, most people, even in the West, because one of the present course of capital right now is to increase its flexibility on all fronts in order to maintain profitability. And one of those things is, it's not just about outsourcing; it's about wage compression in the West. And also, setting production demands and extending the hour of the workday for people who actually are working. So I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to the fact that, just because, people have stuff to lose here, that they're conservative. Everybody, I think a lot of people understand that in the West, the more affluent, parts of the world, that they're just living in a world, or they're living in a state of increased precariousness. And when I think about the so-called proletariat, the potential revolutionary subject, I mean, that's really what it's about, is everybody understanding that they are in fact not only being actively marginalized, but they're disposable, actually. And another thing I wanted to talk about was, in relation to the co-ops and the communes. There was a reason that Marx said that the conditions for socialism are capitalism, meaning it advanced capitalist industry. Because this was the whole reason why the Soviet Union embarked on a crash course of industrialization after 1917. They were the weakest. They were the weakest of the five capitalist powers. They were not nearly as thoroughly industrialized as Germany, England, the United States, and so forth. And people forget that the goal for making the revolution, most people didn't think that it was ever going to break out there because it was so-called backwards. They thought that it was going to break out in the core capitalist countries first, and then when the crisis of World War I came, and the German SPD voted to give the state money for war credits, then the German Revolution didn't happen. The Soviet Union, that Lenin pushed the crisis of World War I into a socialist revolution in the Soviet Union, not just in and of its own sake, but actually so that it could try and prompt Germany into the revolution that it failed to produce in 1914, so that it could connect up with Germany, who could provide capital to help develop its level of development in terms of industry. Because after 1917, the Soviet Union didn't have the capital to produce tractors for mass, for the level of industry, or the level of agricultural production that it needed to feed its people, and so it had to let private industry in and do that. And really, I think that what we're talking about here is that you experience. My understanding. You're suggesting this, I don't know if you said it explicitly, but my understanding of what you're saying is that the history of, statist revolutions in the 20th century, is experienced as a history of nationalism. In that way, I feel like the failure of the German Revolution, which had the most advanced, the most theoretically advanced, the most experienced, and the most influential socialist party in the world, it was locked and loaded and ready to go. They trained their members with firearms, and they were supposed to be ready for this moment, and for whatever reason they missed it, and all we did in the 20th century was wind up with Stalinism. And so in that sense, the failure of the global revolution, because there was actually between 1917 and 1923, there were a series of failed revolutions in the European states, the developed capitalist countries. And in that sense, it's sort of a failure for all time, because the entire history of the left since then is just kind of the history of trying to accommodate to that reality. And I guess the point is that you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together. But what I think that we can do is recognize that revolution in the advanced capitalist, in the highly industrialized world was not only a possibility, but it was thought to be inevitable.
So it obviously wasn't.
I mean, that's only in the sense that, like, history, that world history is like the world tribunal or something.
Inevitable at what point, though?
Well, they felt it to be inevitable.
That's always been my question about late capitalism. How late must it be in order to qualify as late?
So you think that the moment of opportunity was actually perhaps sooner?
Or later? Or not yet?
Well, it will have to be later if it's ever going to happen.
That's right, yeah.
I guess kind of what it comes down to is, what I'm not saying is that, like, I'm just sour because, like, it didn't work out with Marxism, and, like, I don't want it to be somebody else's time. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that insofar as we have sort of historical record of experience of, the most, theoretically and politically advanced attempt to overcome this thing that we call capitalism. I mean, that was the story of the 20th century. And so we can't just dismiss it. What we have to do, I think, is own that history. Pretty. And because part of the problem is that, I don't know that we're in a position to, we can't, simply, dismiss the experience of these people, but we also can't take it as a blueprint. Because part of the problem is that I don't think that we're in a position to put our theory into practice in the way that these people were.
So this is a very general, maybe vague question, but just why the workers? Why is the left so concerned with the workers? And really take that, this is directed to the entire panel, you take that word like ethically, spiritually, politically, etc.
Because everybody's a worker. It makes no difference if you're unemployed and you got to go and stand in the unemployment line. That's work. If you got to collect your check, that's work. You are having to expend effort in order to survive. Everybody's a worker. It is the most common group that you can identify together with. We're all workers. If you're surviving, you're working. Some way, somehow. If it's pickpocketing, that's working. I mean, that's all it is. You can call it, the only thing that makes it unacceptable is it doesn't meet the laws. And the laws determine what is ethical work and what's not ethical work. Somebody, they set the system up and said, hey, this is what's allowable work and this is not. Somebody else figured, hey, you know what? It's more profitable not to do the allowable work. And that's why you got the black market and everything else. It's capitalism upside down, but it's still capitalism.
Well, didn't Marx also recognize that in the epoch he was living in, it seemed to be for the first time that you had a class that was defined only by work. And that seemed to, before that, I mean, even the peasantry had been, I mean, of course they worked very hard, but they weren't strictly defined by their ability to do work. They were also defined by their relationship to the nobility or what have you. While the modern proletariat is this unprecedented sort of phenomenon that Marx would have considered kind of a harbinger, if you will. That's the only reason I can think of other than the meek inheriting the earth. I mean, ultimately, it also sort of goes back to a Christian ethos too, but I mean, that's my hunch anyway.
Yeah, I think it is that, like, in terms of, like, I just want to make clear that, I'm not, all right, so being a socialist does mean aligning yourself with the discontents of society. So when I said it's not, like, just about exploitation and oppression, what I was trying to do is I was overemphasizing the point a little bit. Of course, that's how it's experienced by people. And that, in terms of building the consciousness of people, you have to engage in that. You do. I think that, to kind of draw upon what Bob said, and to draw a distinction between work in pre-modern society and work in modern society, is that we really do live in a society of the values of labor. Like, what is the highest value in the society that we live in now? It's being a productive member of society. I mean, I want you to, like, now does it appear that, like, if you take that literally, what that means, being a productive member of society, it doesn't just mean, being important, or, I'm not talking about, like, the Protestant work ethic. I'm talking about, like, this.
You have output.
Yeah. And, and to contrast that with ancient society is that, all form, like, people worked in ancient society, of course. But the point for ancient society was not to push the world forward. It was really only to make it go around. And there was no social nobility, very, very little social nobility. You were more or less born into a fixed role, and this was religiously based. There is a sort of hierarchy of social existence that is justified religiously, extending all the way, from the aristocracy, if you've ever heard of the divine right of kings, all the way down to the workers, and they thought, and they saw themselves as, in a sort of religious context of, everything in its rightful place, that God creates, like, beings in order to fill, in order to live out, like, a fixed essence.
The poor are always with us.
Right. And, so the values of, like, pre-modern society, that's why they're like, the values of, like, a warrior class, like chivalry, workers for most of history were just, peasants or subsistence farmers who were, a mute background in the pageantry of the ancient world. Only in modern society do, during the French Revolution, the famous, the famous declaration is, what is the third estate? And when they were talking about the third estate, they were talking about everybody who was not the aristocracy and the clergy. They were talking about everybody else, all the people who produce activity in society. They said that what is the third estate? Prior to now, it was nothing, and from this point forward, it will be everything. Because labor is what produces. Labor is the source of all wealth in society. It's not about simply just plundering your neighbor and hoarding chests of gold anymore. It's about our social relations are constructed around the activity of labor. And that's completely unprecedented. It's all over the world too. And it's completely unprecedented, and those are the conditions for a global society in a way that did not exist in pre-modern society, which was highly decentralized. And that this was made possible, at least in part, by the development of machines, which can increase the efficiency of the output of labor. The Industrial Revolution, and also requires people not to have to be highly specialized in the way that the old guild, craft masters of pre-modern society were, who owned all of their tools, and then they received all of the value of their work individually. Now, value is produced socially, and it's done through machines where you don't have to, you don't have to, and that kind of gets to the question of organizing by industry rather than just trade, historically. Because Marx considered, trade unions as opposed to unions by industry as a remnant of pre-modern society. And, and maybe you and Jack might be able to speak to that because that's at the core of, what the IWW is all about.
From my perspective, the organizing by industry, it's, again, you made the statement that, capital is international, and that's true. But it wasn't always. It builds up locally first, which is, there would have to be enough communal growth in order to begin your next step, which is to build a society from that point on. You organize around lines of common interests because that's what people understand. The mutuality. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about us. It's about what we can accomplish together. In a situation where you're trying to take an established system that already has a power structure and take over that power structure, who's qualified to hold that power? And who determines who's qualified to hold that power? That's a question that has to be answered. Whereas if you built it communally first, that's each community decides how that goes.
I guess the question for me is, why can't there be both? We're talking about pre-configured politics. It's about, while you are building up the institutional means to be able to take over the state, to take over the whole thing, that you're also constructing a politics that in the way that it functions resembles traits of the society to come.
I agree.
Yeah.
And when that training takes place as that's built.
Right. And anarchists aren't the only people to say this historically. I'm not pointing this out by trying to say like you guys are just unoriginal or something. I'm saying that's not my point. My point is to say that this is something that, as I understand it, socialists have in common. As Rosa Luxemburg says that she talks about the germs, that capitalism creates the germs of the future society. Like, it has to be on the basis of the opportunities that capitalism provides, or else we just wouldn't even be able to we couldn't conceive of it. We couldn't think about that. We couldn't imagine it. So capitalism does generate, these forms of social existence and ways of relating to one another, that provide the basis for us to think about what we would want a society beyond it to look like. I guess I would say is that it's two-sided. It's not. To kind of draw upon what Shannon said, is that we have to recognize that even if those forms resemble traits of what we want the future society to look like, it's still infected with, the social relations of capital, in the sense that, with co-ops today, I feel like a lot of them have to run themselves in a sort of absolutist manner, in the sense that it's democratic up to a point, but if you let the workers to follow or to pursue their interests the whole way, then it just ceases to become profitable, and then they either fail because they're not profitable, or they just willingly dissolve themselves. So there has to be there's some limitation to that. So what I'm saying is that it's not that I'm against what you're talking about at all. It's that recognizing the two-sided nature of that.
I think a lot of times we deal with the false dichotomy that it's either A or B. Okay, you get somebody who's democratic, but you also have a certain, if somebody who's new to the program has to learn the program first before they're qualified to be engaged in that democratic process. There's a training process that's involved. So it's like in the IWW, there's a constant discussion that goes on back. Do we organize in workplace or do we organize in community? The answer is both. It's not one or the other, it's both. And the reason is because the original IWW model based on shop floor work organizing was based on industries that had 25,000 people working in one place. Okay, now you have 9. You're not doing the same type of organizing. What kind of collective group can you organize around? The community, in which all your other issues come into, your gender, your racism, and all this other stuff. These things come into effect on the community level. You build community relationships first, and you build from there. So both are essential ways of organizing. But you're not organizing for the sake of organizing. You're organizing for the sake of building a better society. You start by building a better society. If you can't build a better society in the community, you can forget about it on the larger scale.
You know, in terms of principle, like, I completely and totally agree with that, but like, you know, thinking about like the history of like trying to realize like, you know, cooperatives and communes as like something sustainable. You know, there was one in just right outside Nashville. I forget what it was called. You know, that started up in the 1960s, and you know, they had a lot of people involved, but then ultimately they found that in terms of like just the resources like available to them in that particular commune, that they were having a lot of difficulty, you know, meeting everybody's needs. And so after a given point, you know, they encouraged a lot of their members to go out and get jobs, essentially outside of the commune, and, you know, wage labor. And because it was in a rural area of the state, like the commute was like an hour, like at least an hour, in order for like these professionals to go work. And then, you know, ultimately they lost a lot of membership. And you see that, you know, not just in the United States too. You see it like in Spain. There are co-ops, and they're essentially like based upon like subsistence farming, because, you know, they lack like the capital, they lack like the technical means and the division of labor necessary for, you know, highly specialized industrial production. And, you know, personally, I've never, you know, had to invest myself in subsistence agriculture, but I bet it's really hard. And and the reason I say that is because they're facing like a big crisis, you know, because the younger generation are looking to, you know, what's going on in, you know, the rest, you know, basically outside the commune. And this is the same for the Zapatistas in Mexico, is that you know, the new generation, the generation does not have a living memory of you know, this project of trying to create something independent of the state. You know, they're being enticed to leave the community, the autonomous community, and then to go, you know, work in tourist areas and stuff. And so, you know, it returns to the perennial problem of, you know, how do you create like a decentralized network that is, you know, able to address this at a pace which is fast enough for, you know, I understand that any sort of revolutionary project takes patience, you know, but how do you address that in a manner fast enough to where the people who are, you know, divorced from the initial social conditions that produced the project, you know, how do you sustain the drive to pursue it in the face of, you know, the opportunities around it? you know, which I think is a big question, not just for this panel, but for all of these, you know, these experiments around the world.
To go on the question of like why the worker, I see these discussions about like post-work and like anti-work societies, and typically in online areas, never on the job site for whatever reason. But I don't know if it's like disenchantment from wage slavery or the desire for like what's the term? Fully automated luxury gay space communism, where like everything is handled for you, like a Star Trek society type of deal, or like this slow oncoming, like conceivably inevitable with the automation. But I'm kind of worried, like we're just kind of ceding the power of like the means of production in a executive and managerial class. We like stop working, if we lose the ability to control what remnants of like society we still have control over just by like in states of not working. I don't know, so get any of y'all's thoughts on that.
I mean, that's why people like Peter Thiel have actually come out and said, ultimately capitalism and democracy can't coexist.
Peter Thiel said that?
He's basically said it. And it's the same reason that people like him are building those fortresses for, this sort of, not necessarily, I think they're probably thinking more of a dystopian future, or some sort of post-apocalyptic problem. Not so much a post-work era, but you do get to that sort of post-work stage where there's going to be a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction, between the makers of these things versus the people who have suddenly found themselves as nothing but consumers, right? There's hardly any vestige of producerism left within the masses that used to be the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or what have you, or maybe even the regular American middle class.
Yeah, mom and pop shop says like the heart of democracy is like a myth that sustains it, really.
Right. But I think that there's maybe 2 or 3 mom and pops left anyway, but
Makes people feel good though.
they do, yeah. It's nice to be in one, but once they're completely gone, once it's all just a matter of being handed down these what were they on Star Trek? The machines or things would just appear if you want tea. The replicators, yeah. Once we live in, I guess, what you call a replicator society, that's going to be its own crisis. I don't know. Not necessarily the classical crisis of capitalism either. I mean, it's its own sort of sui generis, not preconceived, not predicted kind of crisis, I think.
I was reading a funny article the other day. Actually, it was like a year ago, but it was the head of the Bank of England said that we can probably expect a rise or a significant return to interest in Marxism because of like the coming automation crisis. But I think it's really already kind of here, not in terms of like Marxism as a political project, but just in terms of like ways of thinking through how like automation faces us at the present, because they're already doing it in my job. There are 3 million truckers in the United States, and in terms of like the broader population of like more than 300 million people, I realize that's just 1%, but when you put 3 million people out of work, it ultimately registers as a political problem. And I think the only reason why companies are not, fully automating processes that they're able is either because A, it's still cheaper to pay people to do it, like with Uber, or B, that they know that it's ultimately going to create like mass social unrest. And so the question is like where does unions fit in with that? And that's a huge debate, and it freaks people in the unions out, like the rank and file, because like they understand the stakes, but I don't know that they understand like
How to react.
Yeah, like how it could be addressed institutionally. And, you know, I've tried to get a grasp on this myself, and, you know, if you guys disagree, I actually welcome it, because I would like more ways of thinking about this, but I think that maybe the only thing that unions can do is to attempt to control the pace of automation on the one hand, and on the other to demand that the company command that the company A allow the people in those positions presently to work them out until retirement before they're essentially not to fire them and say, well, your job's been automated, but let them retire. And then, if it's completely phased out, then demand that they create new jobs in their place, because these companies are massively profitable. Like, if labor is the source of all wealth in society, and you look at like the proportion of it that is going to quote unquote capital, or to the 1% or whatever you want to call it, it's just entirely disproportionate.
Like expand Walmart greeters.
I mean,
More Walmart greeters.
I'm scared to death that that's what we're looking at.
Mm.
I mean, because there are just like already millions of just what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. They're jobs that, jobs that exist just simply to put people to work. And like Apple understands that like they don't even contribute to the profitability of that country. It's like paper pushers everywhere.
So, on that depressing note, we are at the end of our time, and to be honest, I do think we were actually just getting good right at the end, and it's kind of a shame that we have to end already. But I do encourage, if anyone, I don't know what plans our panelists have, or if they're willing to talk about these issues, with anyone one-on-one or together or whatever. But our official time is over, though. So I suppose. Let's thank our panelists for a great discussion.
Take one more round of questions in case anybody has any.
They just came by and said, we gotta get out.
I'm going to take an extra strength aspirin and probably.
Yeah, I feel you. But yeah, everybody, I guess we're going.
Let's thank our panelists.
I guess we're going to go over to the Copper Cellar. If you guys want to come hang out, talk about this stuff a little bit more, then you are more than welcome.
I would really love to.
And my students, obviously, don't leave yet. You're going to sign your outro.
Thank you all for coming out.
Is this your pencil?
Which class? What's your class?
I teach sociology.
Your syllabus.
I'm pretty voluntary because they actually just finished Marx like 2 years ago, and now we're on the papers.
Oh, cool, yeah. I really enjoyed what everyone else.
It's like the old lady.
Yeah, it's great.